Most buyers think touring homes is the same thing as shopping, but touring and buying are two different things. Today, we're going to talk about what your realtor actually wishes you knew before you started walking through homes so you don't make emotional decisions that cost you money or leverage. Welcome back, guys, to another episode of Closing the Deal. I am one of your hosts, Zach Dickson, and today we are talking about things your realtor wishes you knew prior to getting started touring homes. Guys, super excited for this episode. As a real estate agent, this is going to peel back a ton of layers and hopefully give you guys a little bit of guidance and insight as to what the expectations should be and hopefully is as you get started looking at homes, whether that's on Zillow, Realtor, MLS, or actually touring homes themselves, going to open houses. As always, sitting across from me is my co-host, Sam Enright. Sam, what's going on today? How are you feeling?
I'm feeling great. I'm feeling like I'm ready to sit back and watch my co-host work and bring some value to the folks out there that are in this stage of the home buying journey, right? The stage of getting out there. Maybe how some would consider the fun part, the figures, the numbers, everything's behind you, and now you get to go find the home that suits your needs. So I'm excited to hear a real estate agent's perspective on all of this for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think, as we've talked about previously, it's super easy to kind of, gloss over the previous steps. We talked about it in our 90-day plan episode a couple of weeks ago. Again, in our episode last week in regards to cash, it's easy to, skip those steps and start immediately on to the home search itself. It's so easy to download the Zillow app, so easy to hop on Zillow.com on the laptop, so easy to just go and look at properties and find out what you like, find out what you don't like. And ultimately, that while that is a good thing, it also can lead you down a different path, I should say, as well. So I think that's really the point of today's episode, is to hopefully get those expectations started before we even start to jump steps and start to look at homes as a whole. So yeah, definitely super excited, because I've dealt with buyers on all fronts of this topic. I've had buyers that before they get pre-approved, they already know exactly what they want. They want that 1920s Victorian style 3-bed, 4-bath, 3-bed, 4-bed, 2.5 bath, 3-bath, large home, or they want that brand new build, with all the new stainless steel appliances and all of those things. And I while I appreciate that, and always knowing what you want is always a good thing. But ultimately, my next question is: do we know we can afford that? Do we know
Yeah.
that we can do these things before we get started? And so, while we'll definitely be getting into it in today's episode for sure.
For sure, man. Yeah, I'm excited, because, I'm guilty of it myself, hopping on old realtor.com, searching the area, seeing what's out there. I think, that's kind of the world we live in right now in just general, right? You go online, look at new cars, and very few times do you start that conversation with, well, let's take a look at the finances. Let's see what we can afford here. Let's make sure we're making a smart decision. And usually it's kind of led with emotions, right? You get hopped up, you get excited, and you're like, oh man, I've always wanted to buy a house. I've always wanted this. Let me go see what the area's got right now. What's out there for homes. And so, I think that's fun for most people, but excited to dive into that a little bit more. So if you would love to, why don't you take us into touring homes and kind of getting started there?
Yeah, absolutely. So really the biggest point that I want to make in this segment itself is that touring homes themselves is not shopping. Just like we talked about in that opening segment of today's episode, touring homes is not equal to shopping. And so basically what that means is, obviously we just talked about getting on Zillow, getting on MLS, and that's what I would consider to be shopping or browsing around, So let's just assume that we did do our preliminary steps. We are now pre-approved. We now have a good idea of what we are looking at budget wise. So now we can start to browse. We can start to shop, We have a strict budget in mind. We have our wants and our needs laid out. We can start to browse and see different homes that we like. Now, more than likely, when we're shopping, when we're browsing, we're going to come back with a good amount of homes that we are interested in, whether that be 3, 5, 7, 10, depending on the market, depending on your inventory, all of those things are going to play a factor. Now, when we decide on those homes that we are interested in, that now takes it into the next step of actually touring the homes. And so when you're touring the homes, the biggest thing I tell people and buyers specifically when we're walking in, it is what we're doing is gathering information. We are trying to make an informed decision about this property. We've already decided from the pictures, from the listing itself, that we do like it, absolutely. But the next step is now evaluating the home in the flesh. We're going to check it out, make sure everything is, functionable, is working, all of those things. It's about evaluating the information that is in front of us. And so ultimately, I've said it previously on episodes in our content, but what we don't want to do at the same time when we're now touring is falling in love immediately. And what that will do ultimately is lead to, like you mentioned previously, is emotion. When we start to invoke those emotions while touring these homes, that can lead to overpaying or ignoring red flags as a whole. And so when we're starting to tour these homes, we kind of have to put blinders on a little bit. We have to protect ourselves from ourselves, I like to say. We can't be falling in love right away and ignoring, the big old roof leak stain it's in the drywall in the ceiling, or the fact that, there's a leaky pipe under the plumbing in the kitchen. And those are the types of things that we're looking at when we are touring homes. And so ultimately, I think that there's a time and place to evaluate these things after the fact. But when we're physically in the home, we want to be where our feet are. And that is obviously in the home and evaluating itself. And so I like to say that tours are for data and not necessarily for decisions. So
love it, man. Yeah, talked on a lot of good points there. A lot of things that we see throughout this process, I think, in general, is high levels of emotions. Right, it's kind of one of the drivers here. For most people is this emotional connection and emotional decision making when it comes to buying a house and going through all the steps of that. So and that kind of takes us into obviously our next talking point here, which is obviously the theme of the episode is what your realtor wishes you knew. So what is one mistake that you would say is one that, we already kind of talked about it, but what is one mistake that you see often with buyers that you wish maybe they, had kind of thought through before, actually going out and starting this process?
yeah, it's having those blinders on and leading with emotion. Honestly, it is making emotional decisions solely based on what you're feeling inside you. Now, and not to say that that's not a good component in your decision making, because it absolutely is. Your emotions, the things that are invoked inside you when you're making a decision, absolutely is a good piece of the puzzle. But ultimately, it can't be the only piece. We can't be making decisions solely based on emotion, because that's just going to lead us down a path that more than likely is not going to lead to success, unfortunately. Examples of that are just focusing on, cosmetic things in the home, or, finishes, or not focusing on location because this beautiful home is, just been remodeled or just built, but it's not, maybe not in the location that we're looking in. And ultimately, these emotions leading us to a path can lead us to a point of weaker negotiation, and ultimately give away your negotiating power, your buying power as a buyer. If you've already decided that this is 100% the home, this is what we want. This is what we need. And so I think that the one of the biggest things that agents notice really when buyers are locked in on emotion is that they're willing to really give up anything on the deal. They're willing to give up the inspection period. They're willing to give up their request to remedy. They're willing to give up, or give a higher earnest money deposit, or they're going to go on the closing timeline that the sellers want. And while these things can be advantageous to, secure a home for yourself, depending on your market, they're not always the best case scenario for you as the buyer. And ultimately, that's what we're looking to do when we get you into a home. Is we don't want you to settle. We don't want you in something that you feel okay about, but maybe a year or 2 years down the road, you're like, why did I make this decision? Ultimately, we want you to feel very, very vindicated in the decision that you make. In most typically, when we make decisions off of emotion, usually they're not the most vindicated decisions in the world. And so I think that that's really just the biggest mistake that I see, and kind of expectation that needs to be set up front, is that we need to make decisions based on all of the factors, whether that's emotion, the data, our wants versus our needs, all of the things that go into the home buying process. We need to consider on this aspect, instead of just emotion, because deciding things based off emotion, again, typically does not turn out in our favor.
Yeah. Great points there. Emotion is one of those things, even on the lending side of things, that we see, when, maybe it's going to cost a little bit more for a house, and now we're pushing outside of that, that budget, right? That we initially talked about, like, hey, this is my hard stop right here, is, I want, I don't want to pay over this each month. And then you get out there, and maybe you start to cave in on that a little bit. You start to make, you start to give a little bit on each side. And so, not that those things are necessarily bad, I think that there should be a level that you build in for, maybe potentially finding a house that's a little bit above your budget range, but, taking those emotions and processing them, and putting yourself in the best position possible is ultimately, very advantageous. Because I think we can all sit here and say, I know that there's been numerous amounts of times in my life where I have made purely emotional decisions, even though, logically in that moment it didn't necessarily make the most sense. But, we are emotional beings, and so it's very easy to be guided by that instead of the logic that comes in. And normally, not all the time, but normally those decisions lead to, I don't know if regret's the right word, but, coming back and referencing and be like, ugh,
Why did
yeah,
I do that?
that was, I could tell that was led with something other than logic there. Because if usually, you know, we all get the benefit of what, 2020, hindsight's always 2020, right? And so when you go a week or two or four, ahead of that, and you look back, you're like, yeah, thinking about it now, that probably wasn't the best decision. You know what I mean? But, that's why I always think that it's important to take time to process, those things, right? Process those emotions, separate out, okay, well, what's factual here? What is just inside of me telling me this? Is that actually real, or is this something that I'm creating? Because it's very easy, especially in this, to get caught up in heavy emotions and let that be the guiding force for you. And normally, from my experience at least, heavily guided decisions based on emotion don't normally work out in a positive manner for myself.
Couldn't agree more, brother. Couldn't agree more. I would wholeheartedly agree on that side for myself as well. So moving into the next mistake that I generally see with buyers, it really goes back to the emotion weakening negotiation positions. And it's really, the mistake is ignoring deal structure, or terms as a whole. Generally speaking, when we go to write offers, I have to remind buyers that price is not the only term within this contract. There's so many negotiable terms for a buyer to a seller, or a seller to a buyer in the real estate contract, that although somebody may offer a higher price than you can start to start to work those other terms in the seller's favor to make it a little bit more competitive, or to make it a little bit more advantageous to either A, the seller, or B, the buyer, you. And ultimately, I think when people start falling in love with these homes, or, are starting to make emotional decisions, they really kind of ignore all of those terms. They say, whatever the listing price is, let's go with that. Whatever the terms are, let's go with that. And so I think the conversation is very well had at that point, from the agent to the buyer, outlining all of these things that we can do. We can extend our inspection period by 3 days to make it a little bit more advantageous for you. We can waive the request to remedy to make it advantageous for the seller. We can speak with the seller to find out the most advantageous closing date for them. All of these things are kind of variables that go into the real estate purchase contract that I don't think buyers usually think of until they have that conversation with their agent when they're going to write offers. And ultimately, if you've already fell in love with this house, you've already decided this is absolutely the one before we start writing those offers, that's going to affect how you decide you want to do those terms, and ultimately may lead you down a path to where you're giving up the best deal possible for yourself solely to secure this property that you have already fell in love with without even writing the offer. And I think another thing that I see typically in this instance is, buyers touring homes before they really understand their approval, before they understand, their negotiation points, their leverage points. Ultimately, if you know those things before you go into the home, whether that's, seeing it on the MLS or actually physically going to see it in person, that's going to help you make a little bit better of a decision when that time comes to write the offer on the property, because you're going in with a clear mind, and you're not going in with a decision already made that we have to get this property, we have to have this offer accepted. And so typically that's going to, again, make it a little bit less advantageous for you as the buyer. And again, we want to have you in the best scenario for you. I think that's been a hard hit point in our podcast episodes so far this year is no, it's not one size fits all in the home buying process, and each buyer is different, and we have to, find what works for you specifically as the individual.
Yeah. Love it, man. That's a really important point. And, everybody has their strengths, the seller's looking for something specific, and you, the buyer, you might fit that mold perfectly for what they're looking for. So you have to use those things to your advantage. So getting into, back on, we've obviously talked about some things that, should be aware of when you are going out, when you're starting to look at homes from a buyer perspective, what your agent wishes you knew, mistakes that they oftentimes see. What actually matters when you're going and touring a home? Like what would you tell your clients, when they're going with you, like, hey, these are the things that we really need to pay attention to, and kind of separate out, we talk a lot about emotion, right? Because I think people get emotional about certain things, but what is it that actually matters in your eyes when actually looking at those homes, and, key points that they should take away from those tours?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that number one, I will always, always, always recommend to buyers that they put together a wants versus needs list. I know I've spoken about this a few times previously, but having that wants and needs list like legitimately written out in front of you helps you stay grounded, helps you stay focused on what you actually want versus what you actually need. And so having that list put together before you even walk through a property is very much a key, in my opinion, because ultimately you're going to be able to walk in and have a very, very clear picture on what you want the layout to look like, how you want the house to flow itself, whether you have enough natural light or how many bedrooms you have, what the location is, all of those things are things you absolutely cannot change on the property. So that is really a non-negotiable when you do decide that a location specifically is the location that you want to live in. That is really a non-negotiable as a whole. And ultimately, some of the other things that are going to be on our wants versus needs list are going to be things that we can change as the buyer, as the homeowner, once we get into the property. And so I guess like layout would be something in theory property that may be able to be changed. If there is a wall that can be taken out and change the layout of the property, that's something that we're going to look at when we do the tour on this property. And some of the things like cosmetic things, if we don't like a wall or a room color, those are the things that we can take a look at when we're in the property touring it. And we can, there's apps nowadays to where you can take a picture of a room and you can change the complete like color of it. You can pick the color that you want, and now you can envision that property how you'd like it. And those are the things that may show up on our wants versus needs list, but can be changed. Absolutely. And so also the other thing that we're going to do right before we are walking through a property is we're going to check out the property disclosure form that makes the seller disclose of any issues that they have had throughout their ownership. And so this can kind of be a double-edged sword sometimes, because a property owner that has lived in the property since 1960 is going to have a lot more information on the property than a property owner that bought it and has been living in it since 2020. And so taking a look at that property disclosure form will at least allow us to get a kind of a baseline of what we need to be looking at. So if they've had water intrusion from the roof on that property disclosure form, we're going to go into the bedroom that they've said that they've had that in there, and we're going to check out the roof, or we're going to check out the ceiling, make sure we're not seeing any signs of water intrusion, things of that nature in that home. And ultimately, while that is a kind of a good starting point, we're also going to be looking at all of the things, all of the big ticket items as well. When we're in the property itself, we're going to take a look at the furnace. We're going to take a look at the AC unit. We're going to take a look at the hot water tank. I'm just going to see if we have signs of deferred maintenance, signs of aging, any of those things, because ultimately those things can and will shape how we construct an offer if we choose to do so. And so ultimately, I think that having these things, taking a look at these things, as kind of tools in the toolbox when we do go to write that offer, will allow us to, be in a little bit more advantageous situation versus a buyer who, kind of just walks in, takes a look around, I love it, and then moves on. You know what I mean? Like having a little bit of information and, tools at our disposal will allow us to, have a better deal for you as the buyer as a whole.
Yeah. Love it. Those are some great points there, obviously to be keeping an eye out for. And I think things that probably a lot of people are not, necessarily taking into consideration, right, when they're going to tour a home. So I love it. Wanted to touch on a couple of things here as well, as we, start to kind of wrap up on this episode, and taking a look at the financing as well as touring strategy, right, and how the two work together, and how they combine to allow you to shop with confidence, right? This is a big thing that we tell a lot of our clients when we start the pre-approval process is, hey, I want to completely own this situation. I want to completely, take a look at the finances, do a deep dive, have those conversations with you, talk about budget, talk about goals, talk about what you're looking to do. It's not as simple as just somebody, reaches out to us and, we say, oh, credit looks good. Okay, cool. Yep. Go ahead and start looking for homes, right? We're going to peel back the layers of that onion, so to speak, right? And, kind of get a deeper idea into what it is that you're looking to do ultimately, so that when you do, get connected with your real estate agent and you do have that pre-approval letter in hand, you have a better idea and understanding of what it is that you are looking to accomplish, right? And what it is that you're going to be looking for inside of those budget numbers, because that ultimately tells the whole story, right? Is the numbers of everything. And that's, having an idea of, hey, this is where my budget's at. I have a little bit of leeway on this. I can go maybe $100, $150 above that. That's going to give you, again, maybe for certain homes, a little bit of more negotiating power, just depending on, how you're structuring your contract. And, if you need seller concessions, that's going to be valuable information for your agent so they can know how to construct your offer as well. And so there's just a lot of things that are advantageous about, knowing everything that has to do with financing, obviously, before you start that process. And then another one is, when to slow down and when to move quickly, right? We have a lot of clients in general that, tend to have an inclination to want to move very, very quickly, right? And I think that some of that comes from fear. I think some of that comes from, what's happening in the market, especially during, busier seasons when there is, I
A lot of
guess not
competition.
as, yeah, a lot of competition, right? When you have multiple offers going in on properties, this goes back into those emotions and it ties in. You go to view a home, and you talk with the listing agent. The listing agent says, yeah, we've already had, multiple people inquire, we've already had multiple people interested. And then you feel this like sort of spike inside of you, right? Because you really like this place. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, there's other people. Oh my gosh, there's these things. Oh my gosh, we got to do this. We got to do this. We got to do this. And it's like, at the end of the day, have people gone into those situations and made that decision and gotten the house and been happy? Absolutely. But have there been other people that have, maybe felt the other side of that, which is like, oh my goodness, we just absolutely took this way too fast and, committed to something based on pure emotions. Again, just going back to that, how often do we make emotional decisions and those actually work out in a positive way for ourselves, right? you know and so it's really just kind of taking that information in and saying, okay, maybe we need to slow our roll here. There is going to be other houses. We had a client that waited a year and a half before she committed to buying a house, right? She toured other ones, she had put some offers in, but it was, I can't necessarily say all of the emotions on that side of it, but I'm sure you would be able to attest to it a little bit more. But to me, if that's how you're going about it, there's not a high emotional connection level to this. It's an understanding of, hey, this is the process. Eventually, something will come along that is, ready for me to jump on, that I really feel strongly about. And if I get outbid for it, guess what? There'll be another house. They always come available, right? And so just understanding that it puts you in a much more advantageous position, as a buyer, right? As a seller, yes, I mean, I'm sure you would love to have several emotional buyers all coming at you at once and throwing in all kinds of different offers, right? Because that you're going to have high competition, which is obviously normally going to lead to you being the benefactor of that, right? Or the beneficiary of that. So just something to keep in mind, when you talk about that financing and you talk about those numbers, and you establish that budget, those things should help remove a little bit of emotion from it, right? Because now you have the raw data in front of you, you have the raw numbers, what you're looking to do, and it should help, make that a little bit easier.
For sure, and that was a great example, honestly, of our client that took almost 18 months just throughout the process. Like that scenario of non-emotional buying outputs a negative outcome very little of the time, a very small percentage of the time. Whereas, somebody who's making emotional decisions, whereas you said that it can work out, absolutely, but the negative outcomes of that is exponentially greater than not making emotional decisions. Ultimately, I would say that majority of the negative outcomes are due to just making emotional decisions and making rash decisions and kind of, moving too quickly and not slowing down to kind of process everything that's going on in front of you. And obviously, like you mentioned, there are times and scenarios where we do have to move fast. Absolutely. I'm not saying that, but we just kind of have to, analyze those scenarios, analyze those situations, and, make good decisions from there.
Absolutely, man. I could not agree more with that. Obviously we touched on, some real world examples there. I mean, kind of generalities, right? But, the reality is that when you're leading with emotion in anything in life, yes, there is a chance that it will work out, right? But we're playing a numbers game here, right? We're playing
Mm-hmm.
percentages. There's a higher percent chance that making an emotional decision is not going to work out in the manner in which you believe that it's going to. But there's also times where you could sit back and make logical decisions and it may not work out, where you remove emotions. There is no true, if you do this 100%, this is
One
going to
size
work
fits
out.
all. Yeah.
Yeah, that's not life. And if it was, life would look a lot different for a lot of people out there. But it's about learning from the lessons and taking that. But ultimately, we're trying to in this instance help take things that we've seen, clients we've worked with, people we've helped, take their either their wins, their mistakes, their things that they have done, and pass that on to you guys to give you guys a perspective that shows that, hey, there is two sides to every story here, right? And it doesn't always have to be this highly emotionally charged thing that you go out and do. It can be something that you take your time. And I know that probably sounds backwards, considering, the profession that we're in, right? But ultimately, this is more about impacting people and impacting their lives and helping them more than it is about, oh yeah, let's just get you in the first house we see as quick as possible. If you have, that's just not, it's not the way that we operate. I guess is what I'm looking to say. So, take your time, make sure that, this is a right fit for you. Try to remove emotions. Obviously, yes, you want to feel something for the house. You want it to, invoke something inside of you. Oh, I love this house. It's beautiful. It has natural lighting. It has, the perfect number of bedrooms, bathrooms that we're looking for, and you want that emotional connection, but you don't want it so far to the point that you've past logic and that's gone completely out of the window, and now you're spending $50,000 more than what your budget on what on paper you can do it, but your budget in your mind's like, yeah, that's not it, and you've just completely thrown that out the window, and you're just like, I'll just make it work. You know what I mean? Like, because at the end of the day, that novelty is going to wear off at some point, right? You're going to get in the home for 3 to 6 months, and it's not going to be as exciting as it initially was when you first toured it, because it's not new anymore, and you've grown accustomed to it. And at that point, when you're spending, $300 extra a month on your mortgage payment, are you going to be sitting there like, yeah, that was the decision, that was a smart one, or you could be like, gosh, dang, dude, like, I don't know about this, you know what I mean? And so, it's really a dichotomy of balancing those emotions on both sides.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a great point, because we're ultimately not saying in this episode to not have emotions. We absolutely want you to feel some sort of way towards that home, but we want you to feel that way after going through your checklist, checking off all of the things. Once you check off all of the things on your checklist and we start to really feel something inside and we love that home, that's usually when we are going to feel very, very vindicated in the decision. Typically, if we're making the decision solely based off of the things that we're feeling without checking off that checklist, those are the types of situations where we see negative outcomes, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I mean, that takes us into, just an overall general recap, right, of the episode. What are the overarching themes to take away from this? And I think, number one, Zach just hit it. It's, we're going to tour homes with a checklist. You're going to have an idea in mind of what you want, and we're going to try to remove emotions from that as much as we can, right? And when we say emotions, removing this attachment to an outcome, that you're going to basically get this home. If it doesn't check all the boxes, you have to sit back and have that conversation. Does it check enough of them for it to make sense, or does it not check enough for this to be, potentially a bad decision, right? And then understanding your financing, before going out, that's a huge key. And I mean, a lot of times these days, that stuff doesn't really exist anymore. So that is one nice thing. A lot of listing agents, when they're putting houses on the market, they are not letting you come tour their home without a pre-approval in hand, without knowing that you spoke with someone. The reality is that ultimately it's potentially a waste of time for all parties involved, because you have gotten yourself into a position where you don't know if that's even going to fit your budget, if you can even afford it. A lot of people don't pay for credit services out there, so a lot of people are relying on Credit Karma, Experian, which can be great tools, but are not necessarily huge indicators of where your credit's at, where your income's at, all those things, right? And so getting that financing taken care of and in order first and foremost is going to be largely important to, helping you make that decision. And then lastly, obviously, is, using those tours to gather data, not necessarily make decisions, right? Getting a feel for what's out there, getting a feel for what you like, because you can tour a home and think that you like something, but then you go to the next house, you're like, oh, I like this more. I like the way that this is set up more. I like, you know what I mean? And so you can't possibly know what it is that you truly want unless you've gone and experienced multiple things, right? You can't walk into one house and be like, I know for a fact this is exactly what I'm going to want for the next 3 to 5 years, or however long it is for your life, right? So it's always important to gather those data points and make that decision. Just like anything else, you buy a new car, are you just going to go test drive one and make that decision, or are you going to maybe try some other ones out and see, oh, do I like this feel better? Do I like the accessories that come with this, and go from there before making that decision. So those are that's kind of the recap, obviously, of everything that we touched on and talked about. Zach, do you have anything else to add for the listeners here on this episode?
Not really, not really. Just wanted to reiterate that, emotion is good. Absolutely. We want the home to invoke emotion in us. We want that, but ultimately we want to use that as just a piece of the puzzle, along with the data, along with, our expertise from our professionals, all of those things kind of into the melting pot, into one, and that's how we make a decision. Don't necessarily just use one piece of that puzzle to make the decision, because usually is going to bring about negative outcomes.
Absolutely. Absolutely, guys. Well, if you are planning to tour a home anytime soon, guys, be sure to take this episode, share it with someone who you're going to be touring with. Our episodes drop every Friday at 12 p.m. On YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you guys get your stuff at, it will be there. So as always, we appreciate you guys tuning in. Appreciate you guys taking the advice that we're given. And of course, if you guys ever need anything, we are always here. So
absolutely, guys. Cheers.